Allora, buongiorno. Hi. Can you hear me? No? Più vicino? È acceso? Acceso? Hi, hello everyone, and thank you for coming. To those of you here and online, I am Francesca Tarocco and work here at NICHE as the director. NICHE is the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities at Foscari, University of Venice. We are an environmental humanities focused center, interdisciplinary, but with a strong connection with water and all things water, partly because we are in Venice, so we try to make good of that, but also because, of course, as we will hear in this talk as well, there is a certain urgency around issues concerning water, either too much of it or too little, and the politics of and economics of climate change. So today we are delighted to have with us Andrea Pia and Professor Andrea Pia and Professor Anna Laura Wainwright, who both, in fact, have been spending some time at NICHE in the past few years as visiting scholars. So I'm even more excited to have them here with us today. Andrea, as probably will tell you as well, in fact, finished the book while at NICHE. So, this book is almost, one of our children, and we love that. And Anna Laura was one of the first visiting scholars we had when the center had only just started. Both of them are scholars of China, and we thought that it would be a great thing to have them join us in conversation today. So this is part of one of our series. It's called New Books in Environmental Humanities, where we try to highlight books that have something new to bring to the field, or something new in terms of either geographical scope or theoretical approaches. And I think this book is very important in both aspects. So very quickly, Andrea Pia is a legal and environmental anthropologist whose research sits at the interface between environmental humanities, decolonial political theory, and the critical study of the commons. He is also what in the old days used to be called an engaged scholar, which is a great thing to be, and he has done amazing work in Italy and elsewhere, and now in London and the UK, of course, precisely on the public ownership and the commons. This is your second book?
My first book was a translation.
Was a translation?
This is technically my first monograph.
Your first monograph, great. But you are incredibly well published and has been very active also in collective publishing with the China Lab and Made in China journal. As a discussant, we have asked Anna Laura Wainwright to intervene today in today's talk. Anna Laura is a professor of the human geography of China, but really an anthropologist, and quite comfortably so. And her work is incredibly important in that she was one of the first people to really spend a long time at the grassroots of Chinese life, working with communities, with fragile communities, and on issues like pollution and more recently, activism and the complexities surrounding activism in China. So that's enough from me, and we will have about 50 minutes, 45 minutes or so from Andrea, then a discussion, and then we will take questions. Thank you so much.
Standing, if you don't mind. Hello, everyone. Hi, this is Andrea. It's great to see familiar faces here in the room. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the people who are online at the moment. I don't see you, but also I extend a virtual thank you for being here today. Before I start, so this is, I'm going to be spending, I guess, 40 minutes telling the story of one possible story of my book and research in China. But before, and I'll try to be as discussive as possible, I could have prepared this talk to be about numbers and terrorizing you with numbers about climate change and the new water normal in China, which I'll explain in a second. But I actually do not want to do that. I'm actively trying to resist climate doom or environmental doom. And I try to give you a more kind of, let's say, light-hearted story of how the people who sit at the frontier of environmental change in contemporary China do creatively come up with fixes, solutions to issues in ways that nurture, place-based flourishing of culture and local people and alliances across class and ethnic divides. So hopefully this is a hopeful story about collaboration on the environmental frontier, and I'll give you details of that. Before I get to talk about my book, which is always a pleasure because it takes you so long to write a book, and for us who works in academia, who are crunched, actually squeezed for time and struggle to find moments of relief to really bring to fruition the projects that we work on, also with our interlocutors, to finally be able to say, this is it, this is what we have been able to achieve, is actually a great moment. So I'm happy to celebrate this with you today. I want to thank two great scholars who are inspiration for me, who are sitting here today, Professor Tarocco and Professor Anna Laura Wainwright, who have been inspiring, and I've read their work, and I think represents the very kind of edge of environmental humanities today, of applied and critical, scholarship. And so it was also really great to be able to be at the niche for 4 months, and now it's already 2 years ago, so it feels like a long time ago. But I was sheltered, I was given a room by Francesca, and I was allowed to finish the 2 chapters that I needed to finish to send this to the publisher. And only thanks to NICHE this was accomplished, so thanks a lot again. And Anna, thank you so much for being a referee of my work on so many occasions, not just now, but I guess also articles that I submit in the past. The reviews I received had the kind of, I guess, the style and the stamp of Anna Laura on it, so that's an occasion for me to say thank you again. So, Cutting the Mass Line is this book that is the product of many years of engagement with China, both as a student. So I'm going to kind of weave an history of myself into the story of the book, and I will come back to why I ended up researching water, why I ended up researching China at various points in this presentation today. But suffice it to say for the moment, is that I studied Chinese in Venice, so for me it's a comeback. I also studied anthropology in Venice, so twice I come back. And this book started with my first visit in China in 2005, so this already tells you how old am I. And it started off as a study of, in 2005, and then more professionally, one would say, in 2007 and 2008, when I was also an Italian embassy trainee in Beijing, and I was researching communities affected by drought, and specifically rural community in Mentogo, which is in the in the southwest of Beijing municipality. People who, farmers and rural residents who had been displaced by prolonging droughts. And so moved to cities, moved to second tier, or even cities, or even to Beijing, turning themselves into kind of people who would work for the construction industry, people who ended up working in the service, kind of booming services in the industry at the time. And this was caused by 2 interweaving factors. On the one end, there was climate change. So how is this experience in the North China Plain, as it's usually called, this really big area of North China where a particular climate tends to reside? In that part of the country, we are seeing prolonging droughts, so prolonging periods of diminishing amounts of rainfall during rain seasons. This, of course, is a problem from agriculture, especially when agriculture relies on rains for the water. These communities that I researched back in the days had to convert crops because of climate change, so moving from water-intensive crops like rice, for instance, moving to maize, that is a drought-resistant crop, and eventually moving entirely away from agriculture because even maize could not be financially viable anymore. So some of my interlocutors back in the days ended up becoming miners, and other people, the youngest, would migrate away. And I'm talking about men specifically. Women would stay in the villages, caring for children. The other factors back in the days was the Beijing Olympics. The Beijing Olympics meant the diversion of water from the main kind of sources of flowing water in the north of China. The diversion that brought this water to the area of Beijing that back in the days would have hosted the Olympic campus. So these diversion schemes were, in a way, intensifying the experience of climate change. And this was the main finding of my research, of how environmental displacement is never just a story of a changing climate. It's always a story of how society responds to climate change. That was my main insight, let's say. I wrote in Italian about this. I produced something that I'm very proud of, and every time I speak about my work, I tend to say a digital interactive ethnography about this that is called the Long Day of Young Peng, which is something that you can play online for free, and you experience a day in the life of a migrant who is environmentally displaced by these forces, right? So this is the first time, I guess, that I encountered water issues, let's say. And this made me partly into a water activist in my home region. I was born in Turin. I'm originally from the northwest of Italy, so from Piedmont, which is one of the regions alongside Sicily and Emilia-Romagna that are on the frontier of climate change in Italy. So the regions that are most experiencing changing patterns in weather forecasts. And for instance, Piedmont in the last 3-4 summers has experienced at least 2 droughts and 2 periods of flooding, producing a new water normal, as I mentioned before. So the realization that we could not fall back on usual patterns of water availability, because water availability is changed by the way climate change is impacting, rainfalls and impacting droughts. I'll come back to this thing of becoming a water activist later on, because my research questions do really come about from my experience of being an activist, and I'll tell you what these questions are in a second. Let me skip to where I did research for my PhD, which is basically the let's say the bulk or the skeleton of my book. I have returned to this part of China. So this is Yunnan, the southwest of China. It's the part of China that borders with Tibet, with Myanmar, and with Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Laos. It is a part of China and a part of the world that is really key when thinking about the climate issues to come. Tibet, which borders Yunnan on the northwest, you read in this map, Dijing Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. So this is where Tibet, so that's the border with Tibet and Qinghai over to the north. This is the place in China where the 3 main rivers are born in Tibet. So the 3 main rivers of Southeast Asia, and that provides water for around 200 million people. The Mekong River is born in Tibet and crosses Yunnan. The Nujiang, or the Salween River, also crosses Yunnan and is born in Tibet. And these rivers have been disrupted by climate change and are also being disrupted by a booming decarbonizing industry in China that profit from the extreme potential of hydropower in this region. These rivers falls from very high 5,000 meters high springs on the Tibetan Plateau, dropping to zero in Vietnam. And this water potential, this hydropower potential, is the main kind of resource to move away from fossil fuel in this area of the globe. So it is a place where water is really key, both to the kind of things, the kind of issue that the climate change is producing, meaning displacement of people, as I said before, at the loss of access to drinking water. There are big issues of pollution. Yunnan is a fast-developing region in China that is experiencing a lot of denied water access because of water pollution. So you cannot basically supply water that is polluted to people because they cannot drink it, otherwise they would die. So because of the saliency of the water issue in Yunnan, I decided to fieldwork there, not in the northwest, but in northeast. So where you read, let me just point to here. I cannot disclose the exact place, but it's more or less here. Okay. It is a part of Yunnan which is ethnically diverse. Is the one at the time of fieldwork. So this was 2011 and 2014, and then I did repeated visit in 2016, 17, until 18. That is my last time of being in Yunnan. Then there was COVID, and then there was life impeding me from coming back. That part of Yunnan is one that is most exposed to climate fluctuations. So by the time of fieldwork, pictures like these are not, I don't think some of these are still available online, but these were pictures taken by someone who was then a kind of professor of art in a vocational art school in Guangzhou, so big city in China, that went to northeast Yunnan to document a report on the 4-year-long drought that affected the region between 2009 and 2013. And so this would be a daily kind of view for people walking through the countryside with big water wells dried up because of the lack of rainfalls, with soil cracked open by water scarcity, with people queuing for drinking water emergency delivery campaigns. So this is a farmer in Yunnan who is waiting for firefighters to bring drinking water because they have no longer access to it. And when I say this, I'm saying both humans have no access, but also cattle have no access, meaning that these people are not just losing the ability to drink, but they're also losing the economic viability of their own agricultural enterprises as cattle die because of droughts, right? So this is a kind of life-endangering and, socially transformative experience people are going through. The then Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China, Wen Jiabao, used to call these Pu Nian Pu Yu de Hanzai, so meaning a drought that is the most severe in 100 years. That was the level of exposure to dryness, the level of exposure to scarcity that Yunnan was going through back in the days. And something along those lines, and so this is not just, I don't want to kind of situate these 10 years ago as if these are disaster that happened 10 years ago. For people who are anthropologists, that there is a big literature on the anthropology of disaster that preceded the anthropology of climate. And in that particular literature, disaster are explored as single issues that happen in particular places, and then anthropologists do a follow-up studies of how society has coped, so to speak. We are no longer in that, let's say, intellectual space. We are in a space where we see these events as part of a of a climate that is changing, right? So these things are bound to be repeating themselves. An expression like 不念不忧的旱灾 will lose meaning because it's not about unprecedented events, it's about repeating events that will strain the ability of society to survive or be resilient, right? Or it's about resilience now. So this is Chongqing. Maybe someone of you know the city is in Sichuan province, is north of Yunnan, is northwest of Yunnan. And this is 2022. So China has been experiencing again, and this part of China is particularly exposed to this dynamic, experiencing waves upon waves of heat waves that dries up. This is the Yangtze River, one of the the biggest river in China. And this is at the point of its spring. So this is where the river should be very big. And this is how little there is. Of course, I said, when we talk about climate change, we are never simply talking about a natural phenomena. We are talking about the interwoven effect of societal plan to deal with natural resources in a moment, in a process of change, and the actual impact of weather phenomena, right? So Chongqing uses a lot of water. They use a lot of water for energy production. They use a lot of water for agriculture and for sustaining the millions and millions of big population that they have. In 2022 and again 2023, they experienced unprecedented droughts, bringing power generation down to 75%. 75% meant that the most advanced region in China, so Shanghai, Zhejiang, coastal region, Guangdong, they're not able to produce industrially anymore. And Chinese economy had been slowed down considerably just because of 2 months of a heat wave in 2022. I don't have a picture of the floods in 2023, but just to clarify the point that what we are seeing is never one single phenomena, it's what climatologists and climate activists, and I'll come back to activism in a second, they usually call water or climate whiplash, meaning that floods are interspersed with droughts, and they are followed by floods, and they are again repeated by droughts in an oscillating motion that drives the system away from the Holocene balance, okay? Holocene balance means the perfect weather we had for 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture, right? So this is the new water normal that I wanted to study and that I actually kind of discovered was more as an objet trouvé rather than something that I wrote down in my proposal. My proposal was really about, I want to study how people have access to water in a place where there is no water. And what is China, which is the country that, just to remind you, I do not have numbers here because I think it's kind of might be distracting, but just to give you some numbers, China as a whole has 20% of the world population, more or less. Now it's kind of decreasing and has only about 7% of the total amount of water available, of fresh water available to society, to human consumption. So there is an imbalance there is a structural imbalance in terms of how much water is available. And so China has, across its very long, millennia-old history, confronted some of the biggest water challenges on the world. And so starting from this position that, we all need to learn how to cope with this new water normal, my idea was, well, let's see what China, who is presented with some of the most difficult challenges, is coping. And the book is about that. What do they do to adjust? What do they do to mitigate water stress? What do they do to adapt to water stress? What do they do to compensate people that are affected from water stress? What do they do to repair the experience of deprivation that a lot of people experience by being located at the environmental frontiers of climate change, by being located in places where nature is changing alongside everything else, right? So these are kind of the things that I wanted to explore when I started off with this project. And these are some of the questions that I asked. As you see, this question have a particular kind of, Francesca said, that I'm an engaged scholar. I don't know whether these questions reflect that. But when we say engaged scholarship, we mean, and Anna is an expert of this in the sense that she has been much more effective in producing outputs that has had an impact on how policy are shaped or how debates around policy is inflected. So I'm not the expert in this room, I have to say. But on the other end, I tried my best to capture what a concerned scholarly attitude for climate change should do in relation to these topics, right? Asking questions about equity. Is water for everybody, for instance? This seems to be kind of a very trivial question. We never quite had to ask that question. I can go back to Roman times and to kind of Roman law, and how Roman law defined water as a common that was available and could not, be owned by any individual, and that reflected a time of plenitude, so to speak. In a context where fluctuation of water bring the state, local communities, the market to raise the question of how can I make sure that I receive enough water for what I want to do with it, then questions of ownership, question of equity, question of access become more important, right? So is water for everybody? What about the, kind of fault lines? And I'll come back to this term, hopefully. I'm already talking a lot. What are the fault lines in the sense, what type of inequalities are produced by decision that we make about how to adapt to the new water normal, right? Who is gaining from adaptation and who is losing from adaptation? Ultimately, this is a question of sustainability, right? I did research in a place where a lot of sustainable policies were geared towards making the state more capable of using water efficiently at the expense of ethnic rural communities that were seen as a legacy from the past. These are Izu, so they're not traditionally Han Chinese people. They are a minority people who have resided in this part of Yunnan for thousands of years, had already been displaced by Chinese colonialism under the Qing, and they are now facing the compounded effect of climate change and solution to climate change that doesn't include them as part of what needs to be salvaged, okay? This translate, I know this may sound too abstract, but I'll give you an example. This translates with communities living in the high plateau, the Yunnan Guizhou Plateau, which is this part of the north-east Yunnan, not having lost access to water and either being displaced by the state taking them away from their houses, from the temples, from the places where the culture is reproduced. Largely so now in Yunnan is kind of graveyards and family tombs are actually very important to keep connection to the land. This is all lost by people being moved and relocated in cities where farmers are asked to change their livelihoods and do something else. Or if they are not able to gain the skills that are required to be retrained at something else, for instance, an ethnic cook, that's quite a pattern, a career pattern that is visible in this part of China. They are just left to their own devices, figuring out how to survive without too much state support. So what happens to sustainability when there's very little to be sustained, in the sense that what happens to the policy of sustainability when the state has stopped asking the question whether or not to salvage those communities, right? What to do with these excess people, what to do with this excess land, right? A lot of this land that now is underproductive or no longer so productive, it is now being converted to electrification. They are building solar panels on traditional Yi land. Or new water conservancy projects are approved with the idea of storing water and send it back to cities where Han Chinese are more likely to reside. So this is effectively what water activists for other contexts, let's say usually called water grabs. Water taken from particular places and redirected elsewhere for producing a particular economic dynamic. Keep in mind that all this stuff in China is thought as being, the right sustainable choices, because water that is used and consumed in the city can be more effectively consumed, right? You can have more energy output per drop of water. You can have more impact on health per drop of water. You can have infrastructure that leak less water out of them, right? So all these little efficiencies that exist in urban China, they become the reason why sustainability needs to be conducted that way, right? So these are the kind of questions. And as you see, these questions are fundamentally ethical questions. What kind of sustainability do we want? What kind of sustainability does China want to implement? What kind of sustainability we can learn from the Chinese experience? Is it something that does it make sense to us as a strategy that also may be viable in contexts where we are seeing in Europe, for instance, where all climate whiplash is becoming, speaking about my own region, Piedmont, where this is becoming the normality now. Is there anything here to learn, both in terms of sustainability, in terms of the ethical principles on which this is predicated upon? And as you'll see for the rest of my talk, and I'm not sure how much do I have 20 minutes, you think, Francesca? Yeah? I've been giving, an overview. And I want to give you a bit of ethnography as well, I guess. One thing that my study does is to ask this question, or let's say, one thing that anthropology usually does is to kind of address this very big question from particular places, right? And so I will show you I'm not going to cover the whole book, but for some of the chapters that I have in the book, how people navigate these ethical predicaments and what type of moral choices they make. People working in the state, people living in the countryside, and how their choices are really, in a sense, pushing the terms of environmentalism as we know it today. What kind of environmentalism exists in places where, again, sustainability doesn't seem to work? Is this an environmentalist that can be of inspiration for other communities? Let's say, in the climate justice movement, we usually call these communities MAPA communities, most affected people and areas, right? MAPA, MAPA communities. How is the environmentalism of MAPA communities of inspiration? Can it be of inspiration for other people who are equally or seemingly going through the same issues? So this is the kind of questions that I raised, and this again is because I've been part in the Italian water movements for many years, around the 2009, 2011. These are for the people who is young here in the room. You may not know about this, but this was a movement that brought to vote 26 million of people in Italy against the privatization of water. The idea was that, already back in the days, there was this question of, the new water normal. How do we make sure the water remains available and profitable, and the market can still run the project of capitalism on the quantity of water that they need to run the project of capitalism on? And the solution from Rio de Janeiro in 1992 to the meeting in Dublin later on in the 2000s was that water needs to be privatized. A just price of water needs to be put in place. Water should cost more, and by making water more costly, you're actually giving the right signal to the market to become more efficient. This is, market fundamentalism at its clearest, and has been advocated for many other resources, not just water. Interestingly, has been advocated in China as well, for us reasons that I'm not able to explore now, but we can talk about those if you're interested. So the kind of sensibility of asking the question, is the market recipe the right recipe, that I borrow from activism back in the days, has been a kind of a guiding yardstick for me as I navigated these predicaments in China. So this is the content of the book, the structure of the book. I use the idea of lines, okay? So cutting the mass line refers to a joke. Really, it refers to a joke that our interlocutors made when they attempted to sabotage a water pipe in rural Yunnan, a water pipe that was taking water away from the grid that farmers used to access water for rice paddies and deliver this water, let's say illegally, in fact, to a fish breeding tank for the fish breeding industry that was booming at the time of my fieldwork as an alternative to, to traditional agriculture as a form of wealth for rural people. The mass line is a Maoist concept. Is this idea in the 60s that the party should rely upon farmers to formulate policy that could best benefit them. And it is appropriated by these interlocutors to say that, the party, in a way, through the idea of the mass line, has in fact stopped caring about the countryside. The mass line in this rendition is a policy that has been used to mobilize rural farmers on a vision of China improvement that at the end of the day has probably disenfranchised them. The joke resides in the fact that the word for line in Chinese, Luxian, can be used as the word for a pipe. And that's why cutting the mass line, okay? So cutting the pipe, you can say it in the same way as cutting the mass line. And when you do it as a way of commenting upon an act of sabotage, it tells you about a particular political disposition in the countryside that militates against this kind of market sustainability that I tried to describe until now. And this is something that I explore in 2 chapters in the book. The other chapters are all structured around the idea of lines, because lines, again, in this context of Chinese bureaucracy, does not only refer to Maoist thought, but the hydro engineers I work with use the lines to navigate the complexities of water distribution. So they use lines to indicate threshold of water access, below which people do not have access to water and above which they have, so to know where they have to intervene. They measure this through lines. They use lines to draw, the orientation of their water grid and to intervene on a water grid, so in many other occasions. So lines are epistemologically useful to water engineers to think about water in a way that allows them to bring about sustainability. But lines, as I said, are also the fault lines that are created by the project of sustainability itself. The fault lines meaning the conflict between people who are at the losing end of sustainability and people who are at the winning end of it, right? So the, let's say, organizational principle of a line is what allows me to keep in tension my fieldwork done with water engineers, like these people, that's me in the middle, and in the rural communities that I spend a lot of time with. So I stayed in this part of Yunnan. This is one of these maps, and I know that I have to be mindful of the time, so I'm just going to I think I'm going to talk about very quickly about 3 chapters, okay? I'm going to tell you a bit about timelines, I'm going to tell you a bit about lifelines, and I'm going to conclude talking about cracks, okay? So this is a map of the area I researched, and this map tells you all the kind of water issues that communities I researched were going through. Shrinking water availability, where the grids was experiencing leakages, where the grids could be improved, where the water should be sent. These kind of maps are, of course, technically are kind of state secrets that allow people like this group of people who were the workers of the Water Service Bureau. I work at Water Service Office, I call it in the book, that I work with, usually work on to figure out how to provide water to the local communities. And they were tasked with a very difficult problem. They were tasked with providing emergency relief because of people who are affected by climate change, at the same time as providing sustainability improvements on the local water grids. These two goals, they were usually at loggerheads with one another. It would not be usually possible for people to both allow people to have access to limited water while also making this use sustainable. This is because, for instance, it's more profitable from the point of view of the state to relocate people who have lost access to water rather than keeping sending water to them, knowing that these communities, because of climate change, will not receive any more water in the future, right? These are problems, though, that from a bureaucratic point of view are very kind of sensitive, because these communities, because of sustainability policies introduced by the Chinese state, they relied on their customer supports, including their customers paying water tariff in order to get by. Their salary was directly connected to the water tariffs that the customers were paying. It's a bit like a university in a way, to just make an example. The salary that I get at the LSE is directly connected to the funding we are able to accrue by teaching anthropology to students. If we do not have enough students, we don't have enough jobs. And that's the kind of managerialism that was introduced in China in 2010, making local water institutions relying on their own funding and resources. This is the idea, the guiding idea that is, projected to have a measurable increase in the sustainability that these people are able to produce. No more waste of water, no more waste of funding in projects that do not make any more sense given climate change. No more bureaucratic corruption, right? Sustainability as a way of reforming the local state was experienced by these people as introducing ethical issues, right? If my job is achieving this particular kind of sustainability at the expenses of the support of local communities, how am I supposed to do it? The majority of these people were born and bred in the area, they had connections in the area, and importantly, most of these people were half Han, half Yi, Panyizu, as they said, so they were the offsprings of intermarriage that was particularly typical in this part of Yunnan. So they perceived this policy also through a racial lens, so to speak. They were aware that some of these policies were targeting differently Han Chinese people living in cities and Yi people living in the rural countryside. So in timelines, what I do is to show how people reclaim a particular understanding of left-wing socialist water development as a critique of the kind of sustainability they are made to implement in the present. What's interesting there is that these people are also very critical of Maoism. They say, well, Maoism was very productivist, and productivism in water management means that a lot of water is being consumed for no reason. They're also very critical of market fundamentalism. They say, well, this is sustainability that works for the few, not the many. So they're coming with new ideas of how sustainability should look like, prioritizing low-key infrastructure, prioritizing kind of a diplomatic effort of convincing people to change their water uses. In this chapter here, and I know that I love to speed up, in this chapter here, Lifelines, that is about water bureaucrats and water service office providing relief water to rural communities. This is a water line of people waiting, again, for a fire truck to bring drinking water to their communities. They would close a blind eye to kind of water waste that many of these communities practice because of a particular cultural pattern of water use, and would still allow, sometimes paying from their own pocket, for water delivery initiatives that would allow these people to get by, to live another day in the rural community, to have another chance of thinking about how to repopulate this part of China that is being targeted by climate change and therefore also a victim of depopulation. People were migrating out because they couldn't see a future there. And lastly, so I come to an end, I guess, in Crux, that's me back in the days. Crux is about inverting the lens, looking at this context from the point of view of the disenfranchised, of the people who are at the losing end of these kind of state project for sustainability and seeing how local communities are responding. And what's interesting there is that, for one, there is a process of inverse migration. A lot of people that have moved out from the plateau have decided to come back. This is because being a migrant in China, it's very exploitative. And some of these people have gotten fed up with that. Some other people have carrying responsibilities and decided that it makes more sense to stay in the countryside, to spend more time with your child than living a life as a migrant and never seeing your child for the first 18 years of their life, because you have to work far away to provide a salary. So there is the return migration, there is rethinking the plateau as a place for communal living. And this coming back is also reigniting e-culture, is bringing about a transformation of how people relate to water that draws directly back from political institutions of the E that were adapted to the plateau environment. So one thing that I find in the book is that these people has a tradition of climate whiplash, in the sense that climate change has been experienced in here for enough longer time for people to have produced political institutions that are adjusted to times of water shortage. So they elect local leaders that would redistribute water from water-rich households to water-poor households, and this system would be acceptable. Then reverting to a traditional political vertical authority system where rich people tend to dominate in times of water plenty. These political institutions are being revived by these people coming back. And there is a kind of Latin politics of the commons that is coming into the limelight now, meaning that these communities are actively fighting against state ownership of water as well as marketization of water, trying to find new principles for water delivery through the new water normal. So they are bringing about new ways of mediating disputes between water poor and water rich families. They are actively sabotaging agribusiness and market actors who are seen as dispossessing local communities of their own water. And they are even going to the point of destroying their own agricultural product should their political kind of decision not be respected by the state. And these I have assisted to quite a few times, and I talk about these in the book. So I say a spectacle of anti-commoning, of destroying common resources for the sake of making a political point, local waters to local people, so to speak, right? So that was my short trip, kind of a talk through my book. This is me with a friend, and thank you for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrea, for walking us through the book, and also for literally taking us there in the valleys and the plains of Yunnan. And I leave the floor to Professor Wainwright. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Are people cold? Shall we close the window? Yeah. You okay?
You won't fall as well.
Yeah.
It's going to be one of those fantastic moments. Okay. Thank you so much, Andrea. That was a really great tour de force of the book. And thank you, Francesca, for thinking of me and inviting me. I also enjoyed my time at NICHE, so I have very fond memories of being here. I can only, first of all, recommend the book thoroughly if you haven't read it yet. I read it with several hats, as a China scholar, as someone who's interested in the environment and environmentalism, as someone with young children, and with whichever hat you put on, it speaks to you in different ways. So the first thing I wanted to flag is how, and I think this is really valuable at a time when it's so difficult to take time to do research and take time to write about our research, is the real value in detailed extended fieldwork that is behind the work that you've done, and that only with that, I think, you can create the very empathetic, compassionate ethnographic vignettes that come out of that book. I really like, as a China scholar here in particular, the ways in which it speaks against the kind of dominant meta-narrative of officials as the bad guys, particularly local officials as the bad guys, as corrupt, as extractivist. And yes, some of them are, but there are many more complex narratives and many more complex intersections and experiences that are laid out in the book that, again, I think you wouldn't be able to see without that extended engagement, without getting to know people, without people trusting you, and without being able to have the time to reflect on what you've seen and to write about it really closely, sort of both from close up and as a kind of time to zoom out and reflect on what you've seen. I also particularly enjoy the ways in which there's, and this comes up at various points in my talk, but the hope that comes out of the book. And when I was listening to you talk earlier, you started, at least the very first 2/3 of it were quite depressing. So the book isn't depressing. That's what I'm trying to say, I think. There's some really powerful moments of hope in there that I think are really great lessons for us as citizens as well. There's something you mentioned in your talk just earlier in terms of a critique of sustainability and the kind of meta-narrative of developmentalism and sustainability as it intersects with inequality. I think that's a really important theme in the book, the ways in which improved provision of drinking water for the cities can be presented as an achievement, as a sign of modernization, as a sign of China's sustainability, and yet that is only at the cost of those who are left behind. And in particular, I think that some of the value of the descriptions are that they're not just about the left behind in China generally, the rural communities as left behind generally, but particularly the ethnic minority left behind, who are the sort of double marginalized in this picture. And the label of backwardness that gets placed upon those communities, rural communities and ethnic rural communities in a double way, I think is really coming out of the book as a kind of call for justice, while at the same time you underscore the ways in which the community itself, members of the community, are speaking back and pushing back. That's one moment of hope that sort of cuts across the book. I think that is really valuable. I think many of us who are particularly inclined in particular ways to think about environmentalism are very used to critiquing developmentalism, critiquing technocratic approaches, right? And it's almost become our mantra. But I think the book goes further than that, and it achieves something better, which is to really show you how those meta-narratives are put into practice. And only if you can understand the technicalities of how they're put into practice, I think, can you then see the cracks of where you might disrupt or where people have tried to disrupt those narratives and those processes of extraction and inequality. So those are the fault lines I've really enjoyed in the book, I think. The ways in which they allow a future, potential future to emerge. Some of it you can see is already happening. Some of it you can maybe see as something for us to work towards and for those communities to work towards. I think there's lots of other things I like. One aspect I really appreciated, as someone who never set out as an anthropologist to work on the environment per se, or on water per se, how much it comes at you, whatever it is that you decide to actually do, and how it intersects with so many of the other things that you observe. And I think the book is not only in that sense good at showing you the environment and water as central, but showing how it intersects with so many of the other policies and the other visions that the state has. So rural revitalization being one of them, for instance, and then this kind of response among people of coming back to the countryside and what that means, and how the state tries to reappropriate that as something that they want people to do, but people are actually doing it in a different way, or they mean something different than what the state wants it to mean, if I can put it that way. So just a few vignettes, I think, to very briefly to connect it to some of the things I've seen that are related to water in my own work. Reading your book reminded me of how I started Fighting for Breath, my first book, with this episode of being taken to a village and being kind of involved by the local community in this, championing their health, and particularly their high cancer rates, and trying to get the local water tested. And I think I went into it 20 years ago, or more by now, with a very naive, hopeful attitude that, they're only missing the evidence. If they get the evidence that the water is polluted, and I should say there was no industry or kind of big bad guy that was, that you needed to shut them down to move forward. If only we could get that data, we could move, ahead and make people's lives better. And it wasn't that simple, because actually I got the tests. I think it caused me a lot of trouble in my future trips to the area. The people I knew at the Center for Disease Control tested the water, quickly said, yes, water's no good, but no, we can do nothing about it. We don't have the money. And that, to me, I didn't start looking for those stories, but the kind of stories that come out really beautifully in the book. And they make us reflect on actually how limited, sometimes, to be less hopeful for a moment, how limited our capacity to make a difference sometimes is. Even when you set off with the best of intentions. That was a really sobering lesson for me as a kind of young academic. The kind of critique you have of the commons, the sort of reflections you have on the commons, also made me think a lot about work I did in a different site where, in this case, there was a fairly obvious source of pollution to do with heavy metal mining. But even then, any proposals to intervene from a kind of top-down level, for various reasons, was written off as unsustainable, inapplicable, it won't last, the local community won't, the kind of local community is backward, therefore this will never work. And quite sadly, very individualistic reactions to it among the local community. So people digging up their own wells, perhaps feeling empowered that they've dug the well themselves and therefore assuming the water's better than what the state provides. And that really made me think a lot about, where is the trust sitting here? Why is it that it's operating in such and such ways? And what's changing from the hopeful moments in the past during Maoism, with some of these sort of moments of people being left behind in the present. So underlying all this is a lot of questions around trust in the water test, trust in outsiders, trust in officials, trust in the community, trust that the community can do the best for the commons, and vice versa, which I think come out really beautifully in the book. And the nitty-gritty of the negotiations, even when things go wrong, I think that's one of the best parts of it, that even when things go wrong, you can see hope, because maybe that is a lesson, that can then take you to a better place. To end on a reflection about the present and the future of China, I guess, I know that the most of your work on the, in terms of the field work was pre-Xi Jinping, and then you've done follow-ups during, the more recent leadership, the current leadership. And I can't help but wonder two things. One, methodologically, can we ever do this kind of research again? And we, as in the collective academic we. So we obviously have different challenges if we're foreigners doing research in China, or if you're Chinese doing research in China. But it really concerns me in terms of, what kind of knowledge can we build going forward? As in, again, the academic, the global academic we, including us and Chinese scholars. And on a more ethnographic, maybe societal level, are the forms of, I would call it, prefigurative politics, maybe, that you see, aspirations, hopes that you see in the book, changing? How are they changing? I don't expect you to have answers, but it's something I'm asking myself as I'm reading, and particularly contrasting it with some of the less positive encounters I've had on this front. So I want to leave everyone with this really strong message I think the book has about aspirations to be hopeful. And I think the fact that you end on community members going back and building a livelihood that maybe jars with state visions, and that isn't just about reflecting on water scarcity, but it's also about their own traditions and the ways that they connect to place and to belonging is a really, really important point to take forward. And I wonder actually whether that may have got better in a way after the pandemic because of the, paradoxically, because of job losses and so forth, and lacking opportunities in cities, people perhaps re-exploring that connection. So I don't know whether there's anything in there that's helpful for you to pick up, but thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Anna, for those questions. And thanks a lot for the questions and for the very generous summary and comments on the book. So the first thing about hope, you're right. I mean, I am in this space now. I think it's I was very hopeful at the time of this fieldwork, but as I moved to do research now with Southeast Asian Fridays for the Future campaigners who are resisting decarbonization projects that are led by China in their own communities, and as I am part of the climate justice movement in Europe, the word tainted comes to mind, but it's not the right word. I would say my hope has been faltering recently, and it is hope against hope, as they say in the climate movement, in the sense that the situation is one where with Trump cancelling laws written into kind of American plans for energy development, has Tony Blair last week going to The Guardian saying phasing out fossil fuel is preposterous, as it's not the right policy, and as more water dramas are unfolding everywhere. My very good friend Meghna Mehta, who is also coming to Venice regularly every year because she's doing this great research of the Bangladeshi communities here in Venice. She's also an anthropologist of the Sundarbans, which is one of the parts of Bangladesh and India more exposed to climate change. It seems just the case that the countries like Bangladesh are going to be doomed to extinction because of raising water levels, and not so much has been done about that. So yes, I should have stressed the hope, because this book it was written maybe also thanks to the niche in a hopeful space, and the people I met were constantly reminding me of the power of ideation, of creativity, and of labor. These are people who, most of these people are not water engineers, in fact. Most of these people are plumbers and blue collar, working class, ethnically mixed people who are seeing climate change from the perspective of getting by, not as an apocalyptic moment, let's say, but it's something that is already altered the fabric of everyday life. So it's just another thing that they have to cope with, on the many other things that they have to cope with, which brings me to Xi Jinping, right? Yes, it was done mostly before Xi Jinping, though this 2012-2015 period was really a period where the previous administration started to ossify on particular kind of policies because of the looming power of this new way of also environmental governance, which I have to say I'm not particularly negative about. This is what I would say now about Chinese environmental policy, in the sense that as with everything else, there is so much of policy innovation going on in China. There is so much experimentation about, for instance, how to, in the realm of water, I can make this example, so how you re-envision water consumption as part of a community building project. So now in China, and I've been interviewing people in the, well, scholars, also important scholars in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who are making this point about, community at the basin level, which means, creating institutions that would span national borders, bringing together Yunnan with Laos, for instance, and try to see how water can be reconsidered as part of a diplomatic exercise of making people thriving together in a moment where resources are particularly constrained. There are water chiefs that people are aware of, so people who are in charge of the entire flow of a river, who are given the task to make sure that water is used sustainably. If they fail to do so, then they can face criminal court, they can be sent to jail. So something that has never been on the table in Europe. I'm not saying that, that draconic measure is where we need to go. I am not saying the coercion is where we need to go, but some of the things that are done in China today seems to have, for instance, the San Hong Xian, the 3 red lines that are implemented on water consumption, distribution, and allocation in China. They are the only policy in the world where you have a quota on how much water you can use industrially. So these are policies that have never been seen in Europe, and it's just, there would have been the parts of wet dreams of 1990s water activists, this set of policies. So and we can discuss this further, but I guess we need to, as scholars, the responsibility is empirical investigation in a moment where all of this is very polarized politically. And this leads me to your important question about, can you do fieldwork like this now? I have no idea. I think no. For the most part, I think, of course, I was supported by the China Scholarship Council. I was supported by the Chan Qingkuo Foundation. That gave me, I was based in Zhongyang Nongyeta, so Nongda, which is the Agricultural University of Beijing, and is one of the most important water research center in the country. And so people saw me as being already vetted by someone else, and that's always good. But the reality is that I stayed and I overstayed, not my visa, but I overstayed my affiliation with Nongda, and I came back, and has never been a problem. But as we see with my visa, we were talking about this, I need to go to China now to do a same talk in Zheda, in Hangzhou, in the Zhejiang University, and apparently my visa has been cancelled twice. So as you see from that, these projects that are projects that you are lucky to do, that puts you in touch with people and allows you to create intimate connection with places as well. They require time, and that time may not something that is available to us anymore, also because they carry legacy, right? I didn't say this, but so the book is made of composite characters. There is no single individual in the book that is actually a recognizable real-life individual, so not to ascribe responsibility to any of these people. The real people, some of them have been demoted during my stay. Some people have been, kind of demoted because of corruption charges. Some other people now have moved. A lot of people, in fact, that I know of have moved from this part of China because of their career prospects have been faltering, so to speak. So projects like this carry legacies, both for the people who do research with and for you as a researcher, which imperils this kind of the empirical work that we need to do. That's the thing that we are good at, spending a lot of time building relationship, thinking through and with our interlocutors. And it's important that we maintain this viable to some extent. So if I'm not going to be able to do this, then I'll try my best to allow other people to do it. And that's why with the Made in China journal, we try to publish Chinese scholars who have been able to do long-term fieldwork and who are not let's say, not face great opportunity to thrive in Chinese academia today, but, thrive in general because, India is the same. To do research as a foreigner, researchers in Europe is almost impossible. We had PhD students on a Chinese passport who wanted to study the UK NHS system or in Germany. They couldn't do it because the European bureaucracy is mad and ask for a level of, kind of insurance.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's becoming difficult everywhere. So not to point the finger to China that we know being kind of difficult as a country because of all sorts of reasons, but other countries are discouraging qualitative research, which is really worrying, because qualitative research means basically being able to collect a lot of data without stereotyping, without being guided by hypotheses written in laboratories or on the desk. It's not armchair, it's building hypotheses with the people you work with. And that's what is becoming more difficult to do. So, yeah, did I respond to everything, yeah? Yeah, okay.
Thank you for this, yeah. We can take some questions now, also from the floor, and people online can also. I wanted to say, I forgot at the beginning, I wanted to thank our wonderful Marie Curie fellow, Noemi Quagliati, who has been great in organizing this New Books in Environmental Humanities series. So, grazie Noemi. She couldn't be with us. She's, yes. Someone has the microphone. Le porti tu il microfono, grazie caro.
Thank you for a wonderful paper and the response. I was very much thinking about your question, is water for everybody? And I haven't read the book and I can't wait to read the book. And it felt like it was a question that kind of really replaces Jamie Linton's question, what is water, and how he kind of advocated a kind of dialectical way of thinking with water and about water, and drawing on, Latour and STS and the kind of post-Marxist critiques that he does. Your work here and the methodology that you're developing and what you're describing seems to me to be wanting to replace that question of what is water and come up with this a methodological way of addressing that key question. I mean, obviously not just in the field of human geography, but more broadly in the social sciences. And I don't know if that is something that you think is worth reflecting on, or is something that you've done, or is necessary at all. And I also am really curious about your using lines as epistemologically as a useful way to think about water, as another kind of critique of, or response to so many ways that we've been given these, with Balestre we get the device. With so many people we have these incredible, I guess, interventions, and lines here becomes this. I think what you're suggesting is a really an empirical way of understanding how water is reclaimed, reworked, reimagined by those people who are in those places. My question is, how difficult was it for you to be able to describe these cracks, these inversions, these kind of, how visible and how immediate to you were these ways that became, how were they articulated? When you talk about the critique of sustainability, I'm just really curious about how you came to be able to describe that.
Right. Thanks a lot for the comments as well as the question. I do, so well spotted, because I do work with Linton a lot in the book. As an anthropologist, we are, let's say, kind of discouraged from engaging directly with geography, because we would do ourselves a disservice otherwise, then we become geographer, and no one recognizes us as anthropologists, right? And so all my engagement happens in the footnotes of the book with Linton. But I think this kind of Linton writing in 2010, that is when the book was published, but then this kind of materialistic turn in geography had achieved what they wanted to achieve, but also exhausted a bit of its own steam, so to speak, in the sense that, you know, a material turn, we have witnessed to it across the social sciences. And we are left, especially in an engaged activist space, with the question of, okay, what do we do with it? In anthropology, a lot of people are, for instance, trying to materialize the state. So they're thinking about how state becomes terraforming institutions, how China can be described, so the Chinese state can be described through what they do on the Gobi Desert, how Chinese state can be seen as, this is Jerry Z's book, which is a great book, A Continent is in Dust. So how can power be visualized materially, right? What I'm trying to do here is how you can materialize question of justice through water. So that's what I'm trying to do. And so I start off by moving away from debates that were current when I started writing the book. So the idea that water is a right or that water is a commodity. I refuse both. And I say that water is basically something that we do not make, but we can easily unmake. And that produces question of environmental justice. Because the way in which we use it unmakes it for other people, right? And so what type of questions comes out of that? And some of the answer to that questions are best visualized with lines. And of course, this is not me. I mean, I use Tim Ingold and other people who have been in anthropology thinking about line as a useful kind of metaphor to think about change, transformational change, how lines describe spaces that are, or systems that are going through change that is qualitative in nature. Up to a point, you behave like X, and after crossing the threshold, the system changes and other things, and behavior changes. And this is what, you know, climate activism and climate action, let's say also state action on the climate, is usually predicated on the idea that we are going to reach a threshold of pollution in the air whereby our relation to climate politics will change. Only that this line, this threshold, keeps on pushing, you know, it's being pushed up. And so how do you kind of draw the line down, so to speak, right? And so this confrontation between, you know, climate action and climate activism is also captured with this idea of lines. How did I do the fieldwork that allows me then to talk about cracks? So a lot of this stuff happened at night. And so I describe what people would call night patrols or infiltration missions that we did at night. There is a lot, and these happen many years into fieldwork. That's why I'm stressing long-term fieldwork. These are not it's not that this stuff happened at a particular point in time. This stuff always happens, only that you're not made privy to the fact that this stuff happens. And only after so there were key moments in my fieldwork where people could be, because I was based in the water office for a long period of time, people thought that I would be kind of taking their sides when it comes to, for instance, local projects that local people did not agree with. And so I was not really trusted. That's something that Anna mentioned. There were things that I did at particular moments in fieldwork where there were collective protests, for instance, taking pictures of these protests, sharing them, or videos, sharing them with local people, that made people understand that I was not to be equated with a particular kind of state researchers that are used to, who is someone who is only and simply asking the question that the state is allowing them to ask. And so at that point in time, then people started opening up. And so they started asking me, okay, come along, I'll give you a bike ride. And these bike rides would eventually lead me to stuff that, some of the stuff I cannot describe because it's patently illegal. I describe stuff that seem to carry a particular valence for justice. So like sabotage, when sabotage is directed against infrastructure that are illegal per se. There are illegal, kind of, for instance, illegal connection made by private companies that are sucking out water for their own benefit without telling the state, for instance, right? This stuff happens a lot of times. So when these actions are targeting previous injustice, I talk about. When this action is actually illegal per se, I'm not allowed to talk about. I talk about an infiltration in a finch breeding tank that led to destruction of the infrastructure through a very interesting use of a water hammer, which is a technique by which water pressure can be enhanced in a structure, leading to the collapse of the pipes. And all that happened at nights as well, and required feeding sleeping pills to guardian dogs. I'm not saying whether or not I've participated in any of these. I'm just giving an ethnography. I'm not allowed to say whether I've participated actively in any of these. But what I try to say as part of a contribution to the anthropology of China is that a lot of this stuff is usually written away as, simply, criminal activity. And some of it is. But what I'm trying to say is that the study of this activity reveals there are political aspiration and demands that are usually brushed off by the state that has the upper ends in claiming that this is just the work of criminal bands. These are usually planned by a lot of people together, some of which may have had criminal past. These people are, important members of their communities and very well respected. So to try to diffuse the argument that whole political change is ascribable to criminal people in China, which is the usual propaganda response, is what I want to fight against with these vignettes. But also they are generative for the anthropology of politics that I talk to, and the theory of the commons. And so this is what I try to do in that chapter. Thank you.
Erasmo Castellani.
Thank you for presenting your book. And it's very interesting. And also, as an historian, I have a question that probably is not into the book, but you've probably seen. One thing that Venice used to do from the 15th century onward was to try to, how can I say, test the pulse of the local population dealing with particularly environmental situation in order to get a feeling or getting some information as they were the expert, as they were living in those places, and making political decisions, taking in consideration, not based on, but taking in consideration those voices, let's say that. And I guess that was something that they were doing because they have an understanding that the well-being of their political state was also related to the destiny of the land and the water that they were living in. So now I wonder, I think that sometimes happen that we throw away the baby with the bathwater, right? And that's something that may have gone away, but is also coming back in certain aspects. So I was talking with, for instance, hydraulic engineering, and they are going back to ask local population about the situation of the water in that particular place where they have to build a bridge or create a canal. Now I was wondering if the state or political forces in China were having, when conducting surveys, were getting some information, maybe not in an explicit way, but try to use this local knowledge of the people in order to make decision as an expression of understanding that the environmental situation and the availability of water for the population is vital for the state itself?
That's a great question, and I think my Chinese interlocutors would love this comparison with 15th century Venice, just because they are so much interested in history. And myself, I had to give at least 2 seminars on Piemontese hydroengineering in the 19th century. So when Canale Cavour, which was a great innovation for water in Italy, was created, they wanted to know everything about it. Oh, there is only a 1 millimeter difference in 200 kilometers of a canal. That's an impressive feat. Tells us all about that. So the comparison is a very interesting one. And I think, and my response is actually a resounding yes, in the sense that even more so with Xi Jinping, what we are seeing is the articulation of Chinese authoritarianism, however you want to call it, works by centralizing decision-making while expanding bottom-up overseeing of impact. So they constantly, in this kind of experimental approach to policy, what they do is, let's see what changes in society if we try this. And then they say, okay, we are going to try this only in this region because of scientific reasons. We're going to inform local cadres, and we're going to tell people that things are going to change. And then we trial this for 3 to 5 years. And then we do studies of this and see whether or not it's a good policy, whether it's implementable elsewhere, and how to adjust it in terms of incrementing its value, incrementing its, for instance, in sustainability. This is done throughout the process of policymaking. And it's very interesting to see how this has become the norm. Now, you can say, oh, this is kind of a must line, in the sense that, local people views are kept in very high regard. The other kind of myth that exists about the, kind of Chinese polity is that there is no democracy. There is a lot of democracy in the Chinese polity, and there is a lot of grassroots politicians who are locally elected by leader figures in communities that are then tasked to report back on these studies. Now, this creates, political competition, as you see in the West, though when it fails is when the kind of data that you obtain seems to point to changing policies that have not been decided from the top down. I mean, when people ask for more power, for instance, in terms of the decision-making process, or for instance, what do you want to use the water for? That's a question, right? It is a sub-question to the is water for everyone question. Do you want to use it to expand a city for urbanization, or do you want to use it for leisure? A lot of water uses in the E tradition are recreational. For instance, water paddies are flooded in particular period of time so to allow the reproduction of locusts. And locusts are farmed for food. But harvesting locusts is a children game. Watering rice paddies these ways is not very sustainable because it requires an extended period of watering that adjusts to the life cycle of locust reproduction. And this is not what the state wants. It's not a very efficient use. Who cares about children playing with locusts? But this is the kind of findings that anthropologists are usually very keen to underline, that are non-instrumental relationship with nature that are at the core of what people want in relation to their relationship with nature. And that sustainability is an attempt of narrowing down how water, in this case, can be experienced. Water is just for, economic advancement. Water is just for, there is this idea in the book that is kind of aired by one of the high-level officials I had the pleasure to meet, which is this idea of the big belly society, the 肚子的社会, meaning that they say basically, well, sustainability is not affordable, is impossible for the poor. You can't have poverty and sustainability. The only way to have sustainability is to have a middle-income country. The middle income is the belly. The state is the head, the poor people are the legs. In order to achieve sustainability, you need to urbanize as many people as possible so that you can control the way water it is used in the most efficient way as possible. Agriculture needs to be kind of vertically integrated. You need to eliminate kind of small households farming, which is the backbone of Chinese agriculture, by the way. All these people need to be integrated in vast kind of agribusinesses. Companies and the people who are not assimilated through these schemes need to urbanize and become something else. Only then you can achieve sustainability. Now, when these policies are promoted on the ground and people say, but this is not what we want. We still want to live on the high plateau and be able to teach our children how to hunt for locusts. These kind of findings are not reported up. This is when the mass line chases to have effect, right? And these findings are simply brushed away as, kind of backwardness. That's the technical term, or the other term the Chinese uses is 素质低, low quality of people. Low quality people have a tendency to waste water. We need to scholarize them, educate them, urbanize them, so they realize that the only way forward is urban-driven sustainability. So but the comparison is a great comparison. It's really interesting.
Yeah, please go ahead. Well, we have time, I think, for 2 more questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. This is super interesting. I have lots of questions or things to think about. I think one of them you have just answered in a way of, you're talking about hope, and I was thinking about the moments of fun that people have with water, because it's also very much related to recreational moments. But I think you've answered that quite well now. The other 2 things I had in mind, one of them is, it seems like you did quite a bit of field work with these water engineers as well. And so I'm wondering, as you mentioned their position as perhaps mixed of Han and other ethnicities, what was their understanding or their perception of this relation between state and these minority groups, of where were they positioning themselves or not, or how are they thinking about these water relations in these terms, as someone who's doing the research for the state, but also perhaps part of that and seeing in the field that. And then just, I don't know exactly how to put it together, but it just came to my mind this strange, I come from Brazil in a context where a lot of the time the main media thing or the main idea is that minorities and small and indigenous communities are the sustainable way of taking care of the Amazon, for example. And I'm wondering, that there is an interesting contrast on saying, oh no, this agriculture or the very grassroots are not sustainable. I find that quite an interesting, where does it come from now, these ideas, but just thank you.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Andrea Ballestero wrote this great book that is called The Future History of Water, that has a chapter on Brazil about environmental displacement, about indigenous people being kind of beautified into this kind of version of small-scale sustainability that represents where the country is going, apparently, even though this is not actual politics eventually. It's a great question because you are answering your own question. So the water engineers that I studied, well, let's articulate this better. So the Chinese state is kind of full of nested institutions, and depending on the level that you research you're gonna end up meeting different people. The higher up you go, and of course, the more skillful people are, but the more restrained in their views they are, especially when talking to a white guy that is doing research, right? So high-level engineers would make the claim that indigenous people, which is not a term that is used in China, by the way, because of the political implications. There is an active policy to discourage alliances with indigenous movements elsewhere. So the Chinese Communist Party calls minorities, using the Stalinist theory of minority that existed in Soviet Russia. So they say that minority people are backward and they're not really able to use water efficiently. And also that minorities are kind of...
Perhaps one also wants to say that the formally, the type of anthropology that one can do in China as a Chinese anthropology is this. The anthropology is, what, 90%? So you have the Han anthropologists, the Chinese, so to speak, the majority, doing anthropology of ethnic, so-called ethnic minority.
I have to say that I met, and I couldn't write about them, I met several Yi ethnologists, as they're called, in Yunnan, who were in fact defending their old tradition of water use against these, let's say, engineering views. For instance, there is this practice of saving water in water cisterns during periods of kind of high rainfalls, and to use that water in a different time of the year. That, of course, water engineers says that increases the chance that the water takes on waterborne diseases, and it's against their own self-interest to keep on doing this. At the same time, they praise the fact that the families who collect water this way are the water-rich family that are able then to redistribute water to water-poor families. So claiming that their own way of dealing with water responded better to question of justice, in a way of fairness of distribution, right? So high-level water engineers were part also of state-private projects of water development in the area tend to make the point that these people need to be dispossessed because they don't know what they're doing. We build a water reservoir, we will make a water purification station, water will become more reliable, less polluted. So a modernist view. Engineers who are from the grassroots, meaning that there are at least 2 in the water service office that were born and bred in poor communities, and because they were very good, ended up getting scholarship and studying where they needed to study to become engineers. They tend to have a different view, which is one of saying, well, within the long history of Chinese water management, is not that we necessarily have to fall back on the most recent, which is the modernist one. We have several kind of centuries of developing water in a way that accords to kind of the natural flow of water and meets the demands of local communities. And then they go back to Confucian classics, arguing for this kind of more cooperative management of water, where you have, for instance, you avoid cement lining of canals, you just have earth canals that, if built the way the Yi people know how to build, avoids water pollution and provides water efficiently. So they go back to, let's say, kind of regressive water solutions from the point of view of the modernist kind of gospel that accommodates their ethnic heritage with their scientific outlook, which is really interesting. I think it's a really interesting, again, empirical finding. I never expected this to be the case. I was reading James Scott's, and if you read James Scott's, water engineers are just the devil, kind of bringing about this transformation of society. State legibility is all about, reading the nature and the environment in this modernist way. So yeah, thank you for the question. It was a great question, yeah.
One last question. Omar? Il microfonino? Aspetta.
Thank you. It is related with the other questions, because I was thinking like this kind of clash between these different approaches that is, I don't know how structural is this problem. I mean, that the different kind, because I think we can learn a lot of the efficiency in China, no? I mean, they are doing great things, but I mean, this clash between the local solutions and the governmental approach, I don't know if it is like a structural, but not only at a level of government, no? Because it's also similar in some cases. I mean, for example, in Mexico, some things, I mean, this dispossession of the country by the cities is like the normal way, which is part of the paradigm of modernity, as you said. But also the way that they are dealing with this, with water. For example, we went to Beijing and we visited this hydroelectric government agency that manages water, but also hydroelectric. So they have a lot of power, no? And they have a very particular approach to water that is very different from the communities' agriculture or things. So my question is that, I mean, how these kind of approaches, not modernity, urban approaches, but also the way that they are dealing contabilization, because it's like this system. I mean, the efficiency is great, but maybe the metaphysics, I mean, the ideas, the presuppositions there is the problem. I mean, that this idea of that we can quantify water in the same way and try to make it more efficient, lacks of the vision for local needs or desires, as you mentioned.
Right. Yeah, thank you for this question. I guess I am trying to think how some of my interlocutors would respond to this. I think that there are specificities to China as a developing country that plays a role in this, in the sense that after the Second World War, China was one of the poorest countries on the planet and had some of the biggest humanitarian issues on the planet. So China was ravaged by colonialism and then eventually by Japanese. The Maoist revolution and then the Cultural Revolution really brought about famine for millions of people, and local ways of managing water had completely been vanquished or disappeared because people died off or were killed before transmitting that knowledge. So country need to rebuild. The country need to rebuild, and they looked for what was more effective. And the reality is that, quantification of, kind of, let's say, quantification of emergency measures in China have, you can say, managed to help China, bring more than 600 million people out of poverty in the space of 50 years. China today, so Xi Jinping 2 years ago said that China had abolished poverty in the country, or kind of radical poverty in the country, by looking at statistics. And I think to some extent we should just take that as at face value. I mean, if you go back, and I will go back, but if you go back to this part of China now in Yunnan, compared to when I was in China or first met these people in 2011, their economic condition surely have massively changed. And so when you come to this, the realization that quantification has enabled a degree of growth, people working in the States become very proud of what they can do. And so that's what animates some of the mindset here. That more of the same, this is kind of a quote from someone in the book. So it is more of the same approach. It has worked so well that we just need keeping doing that. It's very powerful. And centralization has been gaining a lot for local people as well. Centralization of decision in terms of how to use water, where to electrify, who should control, kind of what they're called the high commanding kind of resources of the economy, right? So now we're seeing a critique of that quantification in the sense that there is an upper ceiling to, for instance, there is an upper ceiling to hydropower, to generation of energy out of water, because there is not enough places where you can build dams anymore. China has built 300 dams every year continuously for 46 years in the country. So that is how many? One dam a day for 46 years. So that's done. Tibet is the next frontier, and they have planned for that because, generating capacity. They've never been able to do that because it was too politically contentious. They're now in a position where they have subdued local resistance through green policies, and we can talk about that, taking people away from national parks that then become also sites of hydropower. But that's the upper ceiling. It's estimated that hydropower will never be able to produce 22% of Chinese energy in the Chinese energy mix, and that's the upper limit. So that produces a limit on growth, And the limits of growth is a limit on quantification. And at that moment, you start thinking about, okay, so maybe growth is not the solution here. So that's kind of things that came to mind with your question.
That is a very big question.
That's a very big question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for this.
Wonderful.
It was really enjoyable.
Let's have a drink.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks a lot. I really appreciated the discussion. Thank you. Bello, mi è piaciuto. Grazie per l'opportunità.